well, welcome back. I am sure that you are all, as much as you have probably enjoyed this conference, I'm sure you're all probably also looking forward to having the rest of the Sunday afternoon back, so we'll get underway. I am joined today by Kate Washington, who is a Labor MP. She's a lawyer and a former KU director, so very familiar with this sector. And Jenny Leong is the Greens member for Newtown. She is a human rights campaigner and is also very passionate about childcare. So thank you both for being here today to explore this subject. So the first question that I have for both of you is that we have seen in recent years that there has been a considerable emphasis on increasing workforce participation. And in New South Wales and in Sydney, the cost of living is such that for a lot of households, 2 people working is not an optional, it's mandatory. Both people have to work to be able to afford to live here. And obviously, childcare is a big enabler there. How do you think that we can, because then the other flip side is that we've seen it's not that easy necessarily to get a childcare position that matches your work requirements. How can that be addressed in terms of ensuring that there are childcare positions for families who need them for their children, for them to be able to return to work?
Right, thanks Georgie. Good morning everyone. I understand last night was a bit of a big night, so we'll just take it nice and easy today. I'll start out by just saying thank you to the Australian Childcare Alliance for firstly hosting this great event, but also for inviting me to come. It's always terrific to be able to speak to audiences that are passionate about childcare, but more importantly, I tend to learn a lot more than I give. So it'd be good to have some responses as well from the floor if we get that opportunity, because I mean, essentially we're not the experts, and I'm never going to be professing to be an expert. I'm in a position where I'm the Shadow Minister for Early Childhood Education, so I'm in a position where I'm trying to formulate good policy on our side of the fence, of the political fence, and doing that through understanding what's actually happening on the ground, which I think is the big disconnect happening at the moment. I think there's not much appreciation, excuse me too, I'm not very well. There's not much appreciation of the reality, and Georgie, you mentioned that the reality is that people are struggling still to access places and to, through either the lack of availability of places or through the lack of affordability. So there's, those questions are big issues. And Jenny and I are both in the state, New South Wales State Parliament. The federal government largely controls the long daycare sector. However, saying that, the state government has enormous responsibility and is currently, in terms of, it does fund partly into long daycares, but it also, as you know, regulates and implements the National Quality Framework in New South Wales. So we have ways and means of supporting the industry at a state level through planning and better planning and through that regulatory response. So there's, which I know is currently impacting on the ground in certain things that the state government is doing. So how we, and I should also say, I'm the member for Port Stephens. This is not just a Sydney issue. This is across all the regions. Even when I was going back to lawyering, I've got 3 children, and even then my whole income was going to pay for my kids being in early childcare through long day, through a whole plethora of long daycare, preschooling, and one-stage nannies as well, because we just couldn't. The whole mix was crazy. So, and that's the case for most families. We're all trying to do that because ultimately the shared goals need to be better outcomes for children through quality childcare whilst enabling workforce participation for women. And those dual goals are what we all want to see achieved, but we're not managing it well from a government perspective at the moment.
I should, before Jenny has a chance to answer, I did just want to say in terms of audience participation, if you do have any questions, feel free to jot them down on the paper in front. You're also very welcome to put your hand up and ask the question directly, but if you would prefer not to do that, you are welcome to write it down, and Chang is happy to, if you pass the paper to him, he will get the questions up here and we can do it that way, because Jenny and Kate are both really eager for you to participate in this and have a discussion along those lines. But Jenny, now I will give you an opportunity to answer that question about what can we do about availability, and particularly availability.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd also like to thank the organisers and thank you all for being part of this panel and participating in it. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. I also would like to acknowledge that we are here on Gadigal land and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, because it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I think there are a number of big picture challenges when we look at this space, and one of them Kate touched on is the planning issue. So while we might see the current New South Wales government attempting to sort of sidestep this issue, when it goes to issues of planning and issues of actually foresight into what is needed, you don't have to be an absolute planning expert to see, for example, that there was a massive and is a massive baby boom in the inner west of Sydney, in the inner city areas, and you don't have to be an absolute expert to look at the fact that they're planning massive increases to the amount of dwellings through new developments in those areas. So when you look at things like that as what is a state government responsibility, we, as one local example to give you to start off with, we saw a proposal for a new medical research academic precinct in the area of Camperdown. So already where Sydney University is, already where RPA is. What we saw almost in parallel to that was plans to shut down the existing childcare centre in that hospital that some of the workers used to replace it with a car park. And in the big picture vision plans for that urban redevelopment, you saw a proposal to have between 27 and 56 new childcare places as the medium term goal, which is talking in 20 to 25 years. Like, this is just mind-blowing in terms of the lack of integration and planning, and I am always gobsmacked when there's an attempt to say, oh, but it's the hardest because we don't know where the people are going to be born, where the young people, the children are going to be born, but we do know where the jobs are and we know where the dwellings are, and those things can be integrated into planning. And I think part of the issue we have here is politicians focusing so much on the idea of subsidies and seeing childcare as a way to get people back into the workforce, or recognising the reality of the fact that people are having to have 2 incomes to be able to live in the city, and completely ignoring the early childhood educational benefits to the children. And that is the primary focus of what the parents are interested in. That is the primary focus of what the educators and the people running those centres that are the good centres are interested in. But instead we see it almost as a stopgap, as what's been said around the idea of saying, oh, this is a way to actually just manage the challenge of parents being able to work, when everyone that's actually involved in the sector, the parents themselves, actually want to be seeing this in terms of early childhood education and outcomes. And we know that they're amazing, we know that they're solid and good, but what we see is a disconnect, because actually it's almost seen as, oh, this problem that we have to sort of shove in place to be able to allow parents to work and be able to afford the cost of living in places like Sydney, without actually recognising there are huge benefits in terms of the educational outcomes for young people, but also huge pressures that are put on families. And I just say in that context, as someone that has got a 15-month-old baby, having seen on the inside now what I always knew as a theoretical concept of a problem, I can tell you like the absolute logistics of that. Like, I joke that I've got a fly-in, fly-out babysitter in my mum who's retired, who lives in Adelaide, where literally sometimes the only stopgap for some of the plans that we have is to get her to come over. Obviously she's a granny, she doesn't care about coming over. But this is a bizarre situation when you're seeing the existing structures in a very well-resourced inner city area. I'm in a very privileged position in terms of my disposable income, are dealing with all of these challenges to be able to face. The issue is that we need to put children and the education of those young people at the heart of it, rather than seeing childcare as something as a stopgap to enable people to just work more and earn more money.
And can I also say, sorry, Georgia, you're going to have struggled getting through these questions with us.
I was going to say we'll try and shorten them.
But there's no doubt that the government knows, when we're talking about planning, they've got the information at their fingertips to know where families and babies are. When you go and speak to the people that have the big data, and this is all accessible to government if they choose to, they can do fact-based policy making and planning. Because I tell you what, I went and spoke with, I think it was CoreLogic. They can tell you how many nappies were purchased in a particular suburban block in any given week. Like, the level of detail that is captured these days is enormous. And so we know where there is undersupply, oversupply of childcare services, and we are capable of knowing that, I should say. The government is capable of knowing that. But they continue with the rhetoric around everything being in undersupply. And yes, there are definite areas of undersupply, particularly in the 0 to 2s. But there are also definitely areas of oversupply where government planning at the moment is still allowing that issue to be exacerbated.
Well, Kate, that's actually the next question I wanted to talk about, was the fact that, and as someone who lives in Sydney and went through the whole process of we really struggled to find a childcare position for our eldest daughter, and I always tell this, but the only spot we could get for her was in the CBD, and neither my husband or I worked in the CBD, but we had a little CBD baby, so we would catch the bus in and drop her off to the city, and then we would each go, which is ridiculous, but so for a lot of people in Sydney, it is hard to even imagine an oversupply, but we do know there are pockets in New South Wales where there are oversupplies. We also know, curiously, that in those areas, the prices are still going up. They're not going down. And I mean, affordability is another critical component to this conversation. How is that possible, that prices would go up in areas where there's an oversupply?
And there's probably people that can speak to this more easily in the room, I'm sure. When you've got numbers that are going to 60%, 50%, how are you going to maintain the bottom line?
Yeah.
You've got to increase your fees because you've got static. Because I mean, it's complex regulatory controls, but you've got minimum quality requirements in terms of how many people are on the floor at one time and what quals they've got, and so that keeps your you know that there's a level to which you can go, and you can't go beneath that. And so when you've got some of the big players coming in and going into areas where there are already daycares, long daycares meeting the current need, and they're coming in purely because there are people there with good disposable income and are capable of paying the fees, then they are taking enrolments from others. Nobody in that space is capable of keeping lowering their fees. It's just not possible in this. We're talking a free market. It needs to be on a level playing field, but it's not, because the bigger players can afford to share their losses and spread their losses across their services just so that they can gain that market share. And that's happening, and I've seen it in a number of areas. And so that's not in the interests of our communities, where we want to see a variety of providers and people having the choice of providers. But if we keep going down the path that we're going to end up in a scenario where we've got fewer options because the bigger players are going to have market share in a lot of areas, as they are increasingly doing. And I've got to say, when I was on the KU board, it was at a time when ABC Learning was out and about, and Eddie Groves was winning tenders off KU, and it was and that was by dropping enormously on quality, on all sorts of things, and we didn't think it was a sustainable model at the time when we were looking at it, and we were right. But things have changed a lot since then, but we still risk heading into that territory, and we've got to make sure that the planning allows for smaller providers to be able to thrive in this environment as well.
So I think it's right. I mean, if you look at the funding model, if you look at the planning or the failures in both of those spaces around the clear ways that childcare is funded and supported by the government, but also the way the subsidies are put out, the complete buck passing between federal, state, local government attempting to try and do heavy lifting when they see it, but actually not having the resources or the capacity to actually do what the state or federal government should be doing in terms of that foresight and planning. I think that's clear. The other, I mean, as Kate has mentioned, the big corporates entering this space, their interest is never going to be the good outcomes for the children in those centres. Their interests are profits. That's why we have those big corporates entering the space. The question is, how do we actually have a planning where it's not a constant game of catch up? And I think this is the thing. So if you're catching up because you're dealing with an oversupply, or you're catching up because you're dealing with an undersupply, both of those are huge problems. And I think one of the best examples that someone gave me recently about just the failure for integrated good planning around these issues was to say that if you were having, you know, a couple of people over for a get together on a Sunday afternoon, then you'd feel comfortable to not start making the tea or prepare the sandwiches or whatever before they arrived. But if you're having 500 people over, you're going to sort of prepare what you're going to serve them in advance, and you're going to actually put some things in place. And what the state government is currently doing, with a massive increase in terms of development and a massive demand increase, is actually just waiting till everybody has rocked up at their house, so to speak, and then going, oh, we should probably look at that. Oh, we need some plan for that down the track, and it's playing a constant catch up. Now, the thing that I think is really key also about looking in this space is actually going, how do we, I think this is the thing, it's how do we get to a point where we don't, there are two parts of regulation, and I think it's important for us to look at it. There are the bits about regulation that is about the safety and the well-being of the children in care, that is about the safety and the well-being of the workers and making sure that they are treated fairly and that the centre is able to survive and serve as a good participant within the community. And then there are parts of the regulation that actually are about governments failing to actually look at what's the forward planning, how is this being funded, where is the red tape and the bureaucracy that's actually not helping the outcomes for the children and the young people in those centres. We need to make a distinction between those things, because I think what we'll see is the big corporates trying to undermine any type of regulation, and that will undermine then the quality of the care, the quality of the treatment of the workers, all of those kinds of things, when in actual fact those that are in there for the right reasons want to see those things maintained. But we need to talk about the issues around the regulations that are actually causing problems to people that aren't about the outcomes for the young people.
And I, again, just going to say, and it all speaks to, and the perception that I get from the government, federally and state, is that the sector isn't properly valued. The sector isn't properly put on the same level as schooling should be, or vocational ed. It should all be part of the continuum, but the government just isn't regarding it in that same space. It certainly attracts a lot of funding, but the attention that's paid to it is very poor, and so it's always something in the back of people's minds, and it's not considered what the impact might be on early childhood services when policies are being put in place, because of that lack of consideration and the regard for the industry as a whole, and the important role it plays both in terms of workforce participation and in terms of the outcomes for children. And because the government isn't playing that leadership role, that's reflected in our community too, which I find very sad.
Obviously, and I mean, this is not going to be news to the people in this room, but from all of the comments that you've made so far, it is very clear that there is very little coherence. There's not a coherent strategy to deal with this issue, the issue of childcare and early childhood education. What is the likelihood of there being a cohesive strategy in this realm? Because it is obviously necessary. But when you think about the number of different, I mean, Australia, it's complicated here because of the state and the federal. We know that. And because early childhood education and care does not fall within the same remit as education does, not that there aren't issues with education, but at least it's fairly clear who does what.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Compared to things like the supply issue and the planning issue, as you've said, it needs to be integrated into that planning framework, and yet we're not seeing that.
No.
How could we push for that? Is there any likelihood of seeing something along those lines?
Look, I think one of the things is the challenges you have with the different government initiatives and programs having slightly different or competing priorities. So actually, I think what we need to go back to, and always at the heart of this, is like, what is actually the learning outcomes in terms of early childhood education and care? What are those outcomes that we're looking for? And all programs and funding and initiatives linked to that need to be looking at that as the primary measure for how things are being determined. But instead, what we often see is that, and it's mentioned in a number of ways, is you have different parts of funding streams or whatever that are actually setting different goals, whether it's around quality, whether it's then around planning and infrastructure, and then the local council looking at the fire regulations and safety, and then you have a different level of government dealing with the subsidies and how that works in terms. So I think part of it is, how do we actually, and I don't have the solution to that, but how do we actually bring it together so that we don't have programs that are in effect all working in this space but are having slightly different measurables in terms of whether those priorities are being met and whether people are ticking the boxes for certain things. That's certainly an area that could work. On a really big picture level, I think we need more women in decision-making places that understand the challenges of actually negotiating the childcare space. Like, actually, it was not, I can have all the theories in the world about what the Greens policy was on things before that. I can have a genuine commitment to it, but until you realise how broken it is when you are inside it, and that's no reflection on the wonderful childcare educators and workers that are running the centre and doing it. I mean broken in terms of how you're piecing all these puzzles together. I actually think that is a really good reason for why we need more women with children experiencing the childcare. I mean, obviously men as well, but in reality it is, I think you can talk about the mental load as much as you want about where it falls in the normal heterosexual relationship. But I would say that I think that having people in that space that have experienced it, being able to make those decisions at the top, does make a difference. And, it certainly is something that is needed on a practical level to realise how much it impacts on everything that people are doing in terms of the rest of their lives. So,
yeah, and I mean, the point to make there is that when you look at the composition of federal parliament and state parliament, and you look at the people in leadership positions, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but very few of them, the huge majority of the male politicians, have had a wife at home who has done that.
Yeah.
And that is a different position to someone who has had not just theoretical caring responsibilities, but actual caring responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, because that is fundamentally different to having a person at home who takes care of it.
And it's telling to say that when I was pregnant with my daughter and I wanted to find out how many members of the lower house in New South Wales had had children while they were serving MP, they couldn't tell me the men number, because you just don't know. Like, the men just like, it's obvious. So I couldn't get a number that gave me a number of MPs. I could only be told who were the women that had the children. And that, I think, in itself is telling, because it demonstrates the impact that it is having on that level.
So to create a cohesive sector, the state and federal governments need to work together across all the states and with the feds. That's not happening. And even a Liberal national state government is not working with the Liberal national federal government. And I know that for a fact because the New South Wales government was sitting on $365 million in its early childhood portfolio, and that was federal money largely allocated for preschools and for preschooling. That was sitting on that, and the only answer I could get was some accounting anomalies, and I couldn't quite stomach that one. But it was what it was the they were stashing it because they weren't confident that it was going to be forthcoming in future years from the feds. So when you're not trusting your federal colleagues to that extent, and you're having to sit on $365 million on an industry that's starving of resources, it speaks volumes of the lack of discussion and ability to work together. So for what on our side of the fence, and the Labor, my answer is simple. You need to get a Labor Fed and state government in. But no, that's a bit too obvious to everyone. We are already working together. What we are working together on is a long-term vision of where we want to see the sector. And acknowledging a lot of the problems that are happening on the ground, whilst appreciating that everyone that's in the sector needs certainty for running businesses, and you can't have the landscape continually changing on you, which is what happens regularly, and it makes it very difficult to make business decisions on that basis. But so being very cognizant of that, but looking towards where we actually need to be to achieve the outcomes that we need to achieve. Because at the current rate, we're not getting there, and we won't get there with the current system. So the state and feds need to work together. They need to actually not just tinker around the edges and sort of keep tweaking the model that isn't working. It isn't achieving accessibility, it isn't achieving availability, and for the kids that can access it, yes, it's achieving outcomes that are good, but we need to ensure it's capturing all of the children with need, and all to make sure that we are actually achieving the best outcomes for all of the children in New South Wales and across Australia. So there's some really big issues that need to be tackled in the short term. If only the federal and state governments would start working together better, and for the state government to understand the impact of some of the decisions it's making in terms of its implementation of the National Quality Framework, and so appreciating how that impacts on the providers is important. And so it just seems to me that they're making decisions that are having unintended consequences in the sector. For example, the recent I think it's the test. I don't know what it's called. The test that's being applied to everyone that now runs a service. Now it means everyone has to come to Sydney to sit a test, regardless of where you live in New South Wales. That's stupid. It's nothing short of stupid. And for community preschools that have got committees that come in every year, it will mean that they will be actually struggle to be viable and to actually get a committee on deck. But that's in the community preschool sector. It was intended to capture family daycare providers, and we all know that there's a problem in that space, and there needs to be some solutions, and no one is saying that doesn't need to happen. But what they've done is captured everyone that's trying to start a new service, regardless of how many services you might already have, or how much experience you've already got in the field, and how many times you've already proven yourself to be capable of running services. So they just keep making decisions that have these consequences that they're not necessarily understanding nor listening when to change when they make them.
One of the issues that comes up with the National Quality Framework is the amount of regulation that comes with it. And my understanding is that the new guide to the National Quality Framework that was published in October of this year is 632 pages. And the same guide that was published in February was 182 pages. Jenny, do you think that educators are being over-regulated, and that it is this burden of paperwork is coming at the expense of being able to provide the quality education and care to the children in those services?
Look, I think I touched on this before, and I think it depends on the type of regulation. I think that everyone would, anyone that would say, well, the length of that document increasing that much, you would have to question to what level and why. I think, some simple, plain English kind of tests on some of the government documents that people get might be quite helpful. But leaving that aside, I think that we have to make sure that we're regulating strongly in the places that we need to see good regulation. And that is about safety, that's about the quality of the care, that's about all of those things that people working in this space with the best intentions, with the right intentions, are actually not going to object to. Then we have all of the other areas of regulation and concern. And one example recently that we had locally was that we had a proposed development that was for a new centre to go up in the inner west. Now, that development had a number of concerns raised by council. There was a big battle off. Some of the residents were very concerned about the about the nature of the building, and there was a battle off that went on, and now that went to the Land Environment Court, was a huge change. All of a sudden we saw that it was going ahead with some kind of, contribution in terms of a voluntary plan and contribution being made. Now, the community was then like, hang on a second, because at the time there were all these issues around fire safety, around evacuation, around all of these other things, leaving aside our concerns around the fact that it was going to overshadow our yard or whatever. They're like, those things don't necessarily get solved by giving a voluntary, contribution to council. And so on that set to go, okay, so on one hand, if you've got the ability to take that to the courts to battle in that system, how does that then get resolved? And are we then sacrificing some genuine concerns around fire safety and other evacuation things, which everyone would agree are important regulations we should have, versus the idea of all of these other kind of tick-the-box regulations that actually may not be serving what is in the best interests of the educators and the children that they're educating. I think that is a clear example where the big corporates entering in that space may have the ability to negotiate and deal with it. And we know that those kind of things can really be in a detriment to community providers, to people that are relying on boards that are volunteers, those kind of community services. So
we've got to make sure, and the National Quality Framework was established with obviously good intent and out of absolute necessity, and for the reasons that I spoke to before, having been involved in the sector many moons ago. It's absolutely necessary, but it's we must ensure that its implementation isn't unwieldy, and that's what I'm seeing it has become. On the ground, the amount of paperwork is astonishing. The accreditation process is quite mind-boggling to me, and this is coming from a lawyer. I like red tape. Red tape for me is law, and law's good most of the time. But when it becomes impractical, some of the assessments that I've seen against guidelines have been absurd. They have been they've actually made no sense to me from an outside perspective whatsoever. Something about a mirror not representing the child properly, or something. What does that even mean? So I suspect, and I only just obviously get a small, taste of what you would be seeing in your services all the time, in terms of how you're being assessed. There is just obviously with this 600 odd pages, they're trying to remove the subjectivity from it, but in doing that, they've made it so unwieldy that it's becoming very impractical on the ground to be able to implement, and making it very difficult in terms of the amount of paperwork. So I think there are real issues with that. I don't want to see anything being, we can't be talking any reductions in quality, but we must ensure that the outcomes are being met by the way that the framework is being implemented.
We've had a couple of questions come through, and I'm going to read them both out. I'll read this one first. The person has said, you've told us about the problems. What can be done to at least stop the problem in continuing? For example, stopping big new constructions in areas where there are oversupply and a big number of small services are forced to close. What can be done there?
Well, it's the government has introduced this new SEP, State Environment Planning Policy. So that was intended to reduce red tape for new services to come online. In effect, that has the potential to make it easier for that to happen in areas of oversupply. There are no parameters around any needs assessment. There's no analysis as to whether that service is needed in that space. And it's happening, it's not just happening in Sydney, it's happening in regional areas too, where in a small community where a a large provider will come in and swallow up one of the small community-based ones. So, so this is the we've talked to the government about it. And I know the sector has as well, but they are proceeding with their head in the sand in terms of this ongoing rhetoric that across the board there is undersupply, which is not the case, and we know it. And we know in some areas the figures are astonishing. So from policy development in opposition, in Labor opposition, we are looking to see what we can be doing to address that and to understand the problem in a practical, on the ground way. That's something that we are developing on our side. We've done all that we can to advise, or to let the government know that there is a problem with what they are introducing, but there's been no change to what they first put up in terms of their first draft.
I'm sort of getting a little bit of an inkling as to why the government members might not have wanted to be here today, because there are genuinely
I think it's
big concerns that ought to be addressed.
Yeah, look, I think I was really surprised that no one from the government was able to be on the panel today, and I say that because I spend a lot of my time as the Greens member for Newtown doing things and talking on panels where I can completely understand why the government doesn't want to go anywhere near a panel. You know, there might be a panel that's talking about, you know, sort of acquiring people's homes and charging tolls for a motorway or other things, but you can completely understand it. What I find really concerning about this is that when you hear the sort of talk on the issue of looking at childcare and early childhood education, the talk sounds good. When you look at the stats in New South Wales from the state of from the recent report that came out around how we are so underperforming in this state, you would have to think there are people that have this on their radar in government to see how concerning it is. And you only have to look at those in terms of the learning outcomes and the bigger impact on other areas when you start to see the huge damage. And one of those, sort of just to put as a side thing, I happened to be reading the stats on how New South Wales was underperforming in relation to childcare on a plane on the way to Wagga to visit a juvenile justice centre earlier this week. And when I got there, you know, everyone would know that the current rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in New South Wales juvenile justice centres is at 50%. So that is obviously not reflective of the population. You look at the stats around that early childhood education report, and you look at the fact that actually you see in terms of Aboriginal young people not having access to early childhood education and actually being more vulnerable and at risk in relation to those measures. And you start to see why surely someone that is taking the integrated government approach to looking at the challenges here, that dealing with the overrepresentation of Aboriginal young people in a juvenile justice system has to start with early childhood education. It has to start with solving some of these problems. And that is the failure that we're seeing. And I think when you look at what is the answer to these big corporate providers coming in and actually seeing an oversupply, the answer is we have to stop privatising things that are actually key core government services. And that's not to say there's not a space in there for a whole range of diversity in terms of who are the providers. But when we see the profit motive of those big providers being the primary focus of what they're in there for, their business is not early childhood education, their business is making money. When we see that as the primary goal driving the sector, that's when we have huge problems. And unfortunately, what we're currently seeing with this New South Wales Liberal government is an absolute desire to basically put forward the profits of those big corporates ahead of any of the community interests and community need. And that's what we're seeing in this space. And that's why, you know, it is not a surprise that they are not acting, as Kate has said, when the Labor opposition is putting those questions. It's no surprise that they're not acting to make those changes, because in actual fact, they're not actually interested in making those changes because they're interested in allowing the agenda to keep going that way, despite the fact that it is in contradiction to their desire to make other changes in other spaces, because early childhood education and care is so crucial to those learning outcomes.
I think
we have got a question just at the back.
I've just got a thing to say that Jenny, you mentioned about, how you can measure the amount of nappies being used in a suburb.
Oh yeah, Kate was mentioning the nappy count, yeah.
I think it's just the government having, with technology going where it is, they can easily find out which suburb has more number of centres and which doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's just finding an inclination or an interest towards doing that. So I just wanted to check with you, in the government, what can we as educators do so that we don't face this problem in some suburbs where there's an oversupply or an undersupply? So getting an app done or getting the technology done, because it doesn't take too long to get the technology done to find out, okay, this suburb has so many centres already, so do we need some more there or no? Are they already full? They are not full? What's happening?
But under current planning, no one can stop a new service going in, regardless of whether the services are full, and regardless of whether the needs already being met. So the current planning doesn't allow for any assessment of a development application for any service anywhere, based on a needs analysis. So if the council were to knock back a DA on that basis, they would be taking land environment court.
And similarly, it doesn't allow the opposite, which is when you see a new development where you're going to put in 40,000 new homes in Green Square, it doesn't allow the opposite to say, we require you to provide this many, early childhood education facilities, this many long daycares, this many primary schools, etc., etc. It's just not even required as part of the planning.
The conversation is slowly coming around to affordable housing, but we're not anywhere near talking about schooling. We're actually we've got a government that's not actually planning for schooling in places, let alone early ed.
Yeah.
So it's a real battle. And as educators, all I can urge you to do is to, and operators of businesses, is to write to your local members and say that this is an issue for us. And the more that they hear that, and the more that they see it, maybe they'll take that up higher. Particularly if you've got a Liberal or National member in your area, because they need to know. And you could ask for a meeting with them, invite them to come to your service, get them to understand what your business is. Because if a lot of members might be a bit uncomfortable in that space. I don't know what it is, but it seems to be a conversation that needs to be had. And the more that it's had, the better chance you have of somebody actually getting through to somebody that will listen in the government.
Thank you.
We had a question just there. Thank you for that question.
So my question is oversupply, because that is the problem of the future for the childcare industry. There's no doubt about that. I understand there is a shortage in some areas, and it's always confusing. You look at the news and people talk about a shortage, others talk about an oversupply, but shortages being what people have been talking about. Our big problem is oversupply. How do we know? We know if you look at the development applications before the local councils. We're from South Australia. We've got this problem in South Australia. If you look at the numbers, and we've got some statistics, in New South Wales there are 1,000 new applications. In Victoria there's over 450. So there is thousands of applications around Australia. You don't have to be Einstein to work it out. That is our major issue of the future. And I agree, the planning system, the existing planning system, no matter if it's New South Wales or South Australia, does not help. Because in South Australia, for example, childcare centres are encouraged in residential zones. So you can have a residential street, and in the middle of it, you can build a childcare centre. So developers look at that, and they look at land that's relatively cheap. And what can they do on that land once they buy? Childcare centre. Because you can get good rent, great yield if you want to sell the business sell the building with a lease on it once you've completed it. So that is a major problem. And we don't need to count nappies. We simply need to look at the data that's within the local government of new planning applications. So that is our major issue. And look, other industries have had the same issue. For example, the pharmacies industry, they've got that issue. They've actually found a way to resolve it, and they've got controls in place. I think that is the problem of the future. And we're going to increasingly see great centres that may be run by mum and dad closing because the corporates, even the not-for-profits are getting in there. Why? Because the not-for-profits don't pay taxes. They still make a profit. Their fees are no cheaper than the private industry. They say their profits go back to their centres. The private industry say the same. Our profits go back into our centres. So that is the problem that this industry is going to be facing very shortly. And unfortunately, the fix won't be a quick fix. You can go back to the planning, to the local government, and get them to change their master plans. That takes years and years to do. So I think the state, and I agree, the state government must work with the federal government to have some controls about where are centres required and approve them in the areas that are required. If there's a proposal for a centre and there's 3 in that street, no, refuse it.
It's a very valid point, and it feeds a little bit into the second question that I got here that I wanted to ask you both. And it is, do you think that the collapse of ABC, that sort of thing, will happen again?
I mean, I'm not in the sector like I was before, where I was privy to some interesting information before. I think under the National College Framework, I don't think providers are able to run with the scrutiny that you now have at that same unsustainable model that ABC was running on, and with the I don't see that happening. And instead, we are creating a market where the big corporates are going to be thriving. So that's as a society, we have to say, is that something that we want to see? And I'm all for choice. I think that the market should be allowing a range of different service providers to operate long daycares and meet the needs of the community. I think a smaller service is much more capable of meeting the needs of the community than a large corporate who comes and pretty much does the same thing everywhere. Whereas I know services that you would operate, and would probably some of them have operated for decades, you adapt to meet the needs of your community, because that's what providers do, and that's how you survive and become sustainable and provide the beautiful services that you do. So I think, yes, we've got a system that is currently enabling large corporates to make a lot of money.
We've got a question here.
Actually, I've just got a couple of things to say. A simple solution to this whole corporatisation is to limit centre size. The research shows that the ideal centre size is 60. The maximum we should go to is 75. Anything more than that is detrimental to children's learning and care. So I don't understand why we wouldn't just limit centre size, which forces smaller centres where you can be more focused and have better outcomes. And if people do want, because a lot of people say, a lot of politicians say, oh, the people in my electorate want, a childcare centre within 500 metres of their home. Well, you could have a small centre of, 30 or 40 children within 500 metres, every other street if you want. But you can't have 200 place centres in every other street. So limiting centre sizes seems to me a very simple, effective, solution to some of those issues. And it will also stop a lot of the corporatisation, because yes, a business needs to make money, and the more children you have the economies of scale, so you make money. But childcare is not big business. We don't need to make millions of dollars out of our children. We need to make enough money to be sustainable and keep going for the next few years, for as long as we can. We don't want to make millions of dollars out of the children in having 300 children in one spot. So that's a very simple, to me, a solution to the issue. My second statement that I wanted to say is I was at a information session run by the State Department of Education about a week ago, and it was mostly about inclusion and disability support. Yes. And what they said, the minister wasn't there, but they had a statement from the minister, and she said the state government's focus is going to be on community preschools, because long daycare gets their funding from federal government. So if you have any issues with children with disability or whatever, go and ask federal government, don't ask us. All state government money is going to go to community preschools. They also said, though, in New South Wales, we have the biggest number of children in long day care.
Yep.
So we have over 70% of children in long day care. So what they're basically saying is all state government money is going to those 30% of children, and 70% of children, you know, do what you can.
I heard about that, those meetings that were held. And I'll say from the community preschool sector, they walked away. I think they were in the second session after everyone was all together at the beginning of the day, and then the second session was for the community preschool sector. They walked away not having a clue about what sort of funding that they would get. There was nothing definitive, and they won't know until perhaps at the end of the year when they've already tried to work out what their fees are for next year. So
yeah, I was at the second session too.
Yes.
I was talking to the community-based preschools as well, and they're all gobsmacked at how little information they're getting when they don't know what they're, because they've already enrolled the children.
correct, and they're all trying to work out what their fees are under
and
this
now
year
they've
starts
been told
strong.
that they'll
It's
get
crazy.
funding later. They'll know the funding later on, and they have to pass on their state government funding in fee reduction. So if they don't do it, then they're in breach. But this was actually different.
Yes, no, I know what you're saying entirely, and I'm still trying to work out exactly what, I mean, we don't know what they're going to be producing, and we don't know what it is. Well, it goes to what we were saying before. I suspect the reason why we haven't got a government member here today, and they weren't at the awards, at the Australian Childcare Alliance Awards the other night, I suspect it's because if they are seen in this space, they might have to start taking responsibility. And so there is this real sense that the long daycare sector isn't a state responsibility, it's the feds. That's despite the fact that the state provides preschool funding into LDCs and it regulates. So it has and of course, as we've already discussed, planning powers as well that impacts. So there are significant responsibilities the state government has that impacts on long daycare services. In terms of disability and inclusion, this is an enormous issue, and it is an issue that is it is very expensive for providers to provide support. And I know that every community preschool I visit under the current funding model eats into their bottom line to be able to provide the support that that children with special needs in their service need, because the current funding is inadequate. And the federal, the disability funding that's going into long daycare centres, I suspect everyone's still scratching their head around the NDIS, and that funding is personalised, individualised funding where each child has, can access and is meant to access their own supports. But there are a lot of children that don't qualify for NDIS, a lot of children that haven't got a diagnosis that would see them qualified that perhaps should have a diagnosis, which means that you have children in your care that may not have funding for supports that they need, and you are trying to work out how you are meant to meet their needs in a service whilst wanting to provide a service, because these are the kids that really need it, because early intervention is crucial, as we all know. Before they enter school, it's one of the biggest challenges that the principals tell us all the time, is the tsunami of need that they meet when their kids get to kindergarten. A lot of the kids who have never been in any service before they've got there, and so no one has had a diagnosis and no one has had an early intervention, and a lot of the children that have needed it haven't. So this is a really, really important space, and it's one that I'm unclear on where they are going at a state level and what the impact is going to be federally, and whether they're just going to say this is an NDIS problem. I just don't know. So it's a really difficult space, but it's a really important one. And obviously for you as providers, understanding what that income might look like is really crucial. No.
I am conscious of time. Does anyone have any other questions right now? I might just throw one more to Jenny and Kate. And it's around the gender equality picture. We know that in this sector, 97% of workers, I believe, are female. How do you think we can bring more men into this field as educators and carers, and do you think that's important?
I think it's pretty clear if there wouldn't be such a massive underpayment of childcare workers and a massive, sort of devaluing of the sector as a whole if we saw more equality in terms of gender equality, the breakdown of who were the educators. I think that is an unfortunate reality about our society, which is reflected in the way that early childhood education and early childhood care is actually treated in our society. I think that what we need to be looking at is to be addressing the issues where care roles within our society as a whole are not gendered and so unequally placed. And I acknowledge at the beginning that I put that fully into a gendered space when I talked about how I thought some of those changes needed to be made. But that's largely in an attempt to sort of go, look, in a desperate attempt to go, how else do we get it on the radar after so many times of trying to get it into that space. I think that the big challenge we have is recognising that we need to value the role of early childhood educators and early childhood providers in the same way that we see other care sectors. And I think by doing that, we would see probably a shift in terms of how that gender breakdown in the workforce would actually change. I think it's also about acknowledging, and I should acknowledge the Green spokesperson around issues of early childhood education and care is actually Justin Field, who is my Greens Upper House colleague, and he takes this issue on with a level of commitment and has been in conversations with a number of people around this space, recognising the need that it should be something that actually is recognised across the board and isn't gendered. But I think the big challenge is being able to value the education and care outcomes that are provided by the people in this sector, and by increasing the respect and value for that, we will then see a shift in how that gender skew is happening. That's unfortunately a result of how society sits, but that's the challenge I think we have. Okay.
The challenge is great because as largely private providers of a service, how do you increase your costs? How do you increase your employment costs at the end of the day whilst still turning a profit? And we as a society have to work out and have to make that decision that we are going to value all workers equally, whether it's in a care role or whether it's somebody that's changing the power lines. So obviously in this sector there is a really large underpayment, devaluing of the workers, and it reflects on your businesses because it's hard to firstly get workers and then to retain them, especially when you're talking teachers that could be earning $30,000 more if they were stepped into the school ground. So it is with the same qualifications, and it's in the disability space, it's in early ed, and it's historical, and it's something that has to be corrected. And there's no question it has to be corrected, but who is going to bear that and how are we going to achieve it? This is what we need to have, this long-term vision that we all work together towards, which includes a sector where the teachers and educators in early education are properly valued for the work that they do. And this has a much bigger picture in terms of how women are treated in our communities more broadly as well. It goes to domestic violence, it goes to all sorts of really deep-rooted issues, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, but very cognizant of ensuring that we also have to maintain a vibrant business sector as well as achieving equality for women who are working in this area. So, I mean, there's no question that the work undertaken by early educators and teachers is some of the most important work that anybody does. They are transforming little people's lives and allowing them to gain benefits for their entire lifetime. There's nothing in my mind that is equal to that. So the fact that we are continuing to have underpayment for those workers is something that must be corrected, whether it means we get more men into the sector Honestly, I don't care. I mean, it's probably good in terms of role modelling for the kids, that we've got more, that it's a bit more gender equality in there, but we just need to ensure that the workers are valued properly whilst maintaining a sector that's capable of being sustainable and thriving.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you, Kate, for your time today. I will ask one more time if there's more questions, but if there isn't, I might call to Chen, or do you want me to wrap it up? Well, guys, you're all done. Thank you. And thank you very much for giving the three of us your time, for giving me some of your time earlier. I hope that you have found the entire conference program inspiring and informative, and that you are taking away a lot from these days. So thank you very much.